Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to the Friday, May 21st, 2010 episode of Counter-Racist Evolving Engineer. The acronym for the program is CREE, C-R-E-E, and that is my handle. Today, this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are in the world, could even be this morning if you're in the UK, it is my great pleasure to have as our guest for 1 hour author Michelle Alexander, who has just been on she's on the speaking tour. She's been on C-SPAN, Democracy Now! I'm not sure if I caught her on NPR, but her book is entitled The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and it is published by the New Press. And since we only have her for about an hour, and I do want to allow for 10 to 15 minutes of questions from callers if they have them, I basically just want to get her talking. Every time that I have listened to a podcast of her or seen her on the air, I've always been left thinking that she was not given enough time. So I don't want to do a whole lot of talking. I think she explains her book very well. The book itself, I encourage everybody to go out and get this book. But it's amazing. I think the only preamble I would have is the question, and it may be the only question that I ask, besides maybe some clarifying ones. Ms. Alexander, first of all, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
As what I call myself as a counter-racist scientist, a scientist attempter, it is my belief that we exist in a global system of racism, white supremacy. I use those two terms synonymously, and that it operates in every area of people activity. Normally, I name the 9 that they are: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. But in your book, I think you've laid out, if I'm incorrect, I'm sure you will wax eloquently on it, but it seems that the basic premise and tenet of your book is that the area of law in this area of the world is not just one area of people activity in which racism, white supremacy operates like the others, but that it is the basic architecture of racism, white supremacy in this part of the world that we call the United States today. It's not just an area, it is the framework itself. If I've gotten that incorrect, it seems like that might be a good starting point, and if it's partially correct or wholly correct, I'm sure you can take it from there.
Yes, well, a little more than a decade ago, I was someone who believed that, racial bias permeated our society. Often people held unconscious biases, but there were also plenty of conscious biases, and that, this bias infected social, political, economic institutions of all kinds. And, I was working as a civil rights lawyer, primarily in the area of employment discrimination. And so, I was very familiar with the way, stereotyping and unconscious bias as well as conscious bias can permeate, decision-making at all levels of an institution with truly, devastating consequences. So when I joined the ACLU to lead their racial justice project, I just assumed that the criminal justice reform work that I would be doing there would be much like the reform work that I had done in the area of employment discrimination and other contexts. And so I just thought to myself, well, I'll just shift my focus from employment discrimination to criminal justice reform and try to work with others to root out racial bias wherever it rears its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, after years of working on issues of racial profiling, drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, police brutality, and the extraordinary hurdles facing those who've been branded felons as they attempt to re-enter society, I came to the conclusion that I had been wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. It is, I believe, the primary vehicle in the United States for the creation and maintenance of racial hierarchy. The book argues that, within a few decades after the collapse of Jim Crow, the old Jim Crow, we as a nation have managed to recreate racial caste in America. Of course, with the election of Barack Obama, it's widely believed that we finally triumphed over race. But if you look at some major American cities today, the majority of African American men are locked behind bars or labeled felons for life. And once labeled felons, they're trapped in a permanent second-class status in which they may be denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. That's why I say we haven't ended racial caste in America. We've merely redesigned it. We now use our criminal justice system as a vehicle for recreating racial caste in our society.
Right. I saw where you had written that what has changed is not the practice, I'm paraphrasing here, but rather the languaging of the behavior that creates what you're calling racial hierarchy. If I were to use the word white supremacy instead of racial hierarchy, would that be a misstatement to you, or is that something that you would feel comfortable with?
No, I think it's essentially the same thing. I mean, I think there's, many ways of characterizing the way the system functions and the ideology that supports it. I often use the term racial caste and the terms racial caste and racial hierarchy to reflect the fact that, so many of the people who play critical roles in this system do not consciously believe themselves to be biased or racist or consciously think to themselves, I'm superior to, anyone else or to another. And if you take a look at the criminal justice system today, many of the people who are police chiefs, look at Eric Holder, who's now running the Justice Department and in charge of our nation's war on drugs. These are people of color. And I think it's important to recognize that, these are systems and institutions that function in a manner that locks people in a permanent second-class status and a subordinate status by law. It's not simply a function of racial bias. But, absolutely, we have seen throughout history that white supremacy, racial bias mutates and changes and adapts to, the political, economic, and social context, of the time. And, many people will say to me, how can you possibly claim that something akin to a racial caste system exists in the United States today? Say, well, just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Condoleezza Rice. Just look at Colin Powell. And the list goes on and on of, highly visible, African Americans who have achieved, wealth, power, fame, and these individuals are held out as, proof that something akin to a caste system could not possibly exist. But, of course, no caste system in the United States has ever governed all African Americans. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery there were even some black slave owners, not many, but some. And during Jim Crow there were some black lawyers and doctors, not many, but some. Right. So, the mere fact that some African Americans have experienced great success in recent years doesn't mean that something akin to a racial caste system no longer exists. The extraordinary nature of individual black achievement today is a good indicator that the old Jim Crow system is dead, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have simply taken a different form.
Yes, and you also point out that in addition to the fact that there have always been black people who have not been wholly governed by whatever completely governed by the architecture or the tactics used by white supremacy of that time, you point out two other things, which is that, one, there have always been black people who have been used to operate the architecture of white supremacy at any given time, and that, thirdly, there have always been a few white folks who are caught in the same mechanism, but that it works on a business of percentages in which the overwhelming majority of people who are mistreated with that architecture are black people.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And that, clearly remains, the case today. Just because there were black slave drivers or black slave owners doesn't mean that slavery was not a system of racial control. It most certainly was. And even though during the Jim Crow era there were some black folks who resisted the civil rights movement and felt that the status quo better preserve their economic interest and, any disruption, those folks are complicit with the prevailing system of racial control, and they played key roles in it. But their existence, I don't believe, negates the nature of the system itself.
In fact, it may actually support it because I think, as you point out in your book, it serves to support denial.
Absolutely. Black exceptionalism, individual black success, was a real threat to the Jim Crow system. Jim Crow laws were predicated on the notion that African Americans were, innately inferior, lacking in, the same measure of intelligence, discipline, and capacity as whites. And so, individual black achievement threatened the ideology of the Jim Crow system. But it doesn't threaten the ideology underlying mass incarceration because mass incarceration is, formally colorblind. Today, most people support mass incarceration in its current form precisely because there are examples of individual black success which rationalize the harsh treatment of those who supposedly failed to play by the rules that other African Americans have been able to play by quite well. So, individual examples of black success actually give license to the harsh treatment of African Americans through our criminal justice system today. They rationalize, the suffering and really the persecution of those people on the grounds that they have a choice and they could avoid doing prison time and avoid being relegated to a permanent second-class status if only they would make better choices. And, of course, this kind of narrative obscures the fact that for poor people of color in ghetto communities today, where there is a school-to-prison pipeline firmly in place, jobless communities where schools are designed really as, nothing more than warehouses for young people before they are rounded off and, trotted to prison. The idea that these young people who are often stopped and searched on the way to school, frisked, and their cars searched once they learn to drive, that they have the same options that suburban white students do attending their schools, and that they are free to avoid inclusion in the criminal justice system is, quite often nothing more than a myth. And that's why I use the language of caste in this book. I think it's critically important that we break out of, the underclass debate, which, conceptualizes, poor people of color as kind of mired in a culture of poverty. And really this book is meant to highlight the ways in which African Americans and, increasingly Latinos are trapped by law in an inferior second-class status for life. That the criminal justice system, the way it's designed now, labels and brands young people of color early as felons and as criminals, and once you're branded, all the forms of legal discrimination that we supposedly left behind are suddenly legal again, and you are in a permanent second-class status for the rest of your life.
Right. You had said that the prison label is actually more devastating on the life of a black person, period, but I would say much more so for a black person, given the studies that show that a white person with a criminal history has a better chance of getting a job than a black person does not. But the prison label for a black person is actually more devastating on their life chances, and more devastating on their life than the prison time itself, no matter how long it was or how short it was. I think that is a lot of what your book is talking about. Can you explain that?
Yes, absolutely. There has been, some, attention in recent years in the criminal justice reform community to, reducing sentences, and lots of effort has been put into eliminating harsh mandatory minimum sentences. And, I'm a big supporter of that work, particularly for drug offenders. The 10, 15, 20-year life sentences that are handed down for people who are simply caught with drugs, it's just unheard of anywhere else in the world. And most other places, most other Western democracies, if you're caught with some drugs, the amount of time you'll do, if any, is measured in months or, weeks, certainly not decades, like it's common practice here in the United States. So reducing the amount of time people spend behind bars is critically important, but simply reducing the amount of time people spend behind bars by itself does nothing to cripple the basic architecture of the new Jim Crow. This system does depend on the prison label rather than prison time. It's the branding of someone as a felon, which authorizes their treatment as a second-class citizen for the rest of their life. For example, employment discrimination, perfectly legal once you've been branded a felon. Virtually all job applications, ranging from McDonald's clerk to accountant, has that box on, the employment application that you are required to check if you've ever been convicted of a felony. It doesn't matter if you were convicted last week or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. If you've ever in your life been convicted of a felony, you've got to check that box. And, studies show that, even for those convicted of drug offenses, 70% of employers won't even consider hiring someone convicted of a drug felony. Never mind that the majority of Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime, but if you have a drug felony and you check that box, the overwhelming majority of employers won't even consider hiring you or just throw your application in the trash. housing discrimination, perfectly legal against people branded felons. In fact, you are barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years once you're released from prison. And your family members or friends or relatives risk eviction if they allow you to stay with them. So here you are, released from prison, no job, nowhere to go. Many homeless shelters now screen for felony convictions as well.
Wow.
Public housing is off limits. Homeless shelters may be off limits. What do you expect it to do? Well, you can't even feed yourself if you're a drug felon. Food stamps are off limits to you for the rest of your life if you're a drug felon. Thanks to President Clinton, drug felons, people who are labeled drug felons, are ineligible even for food stamps for the rest of their lives. Pregnant women, people with HIV and AIDS, no matter how poor or sick you may be, can't even get food. What do we expect these folks to do? Well, we actually expect them to pay back thousands of dollars in fees, fines, and court costs, often as a condition of their parole. Many people don't realize that when people are released from prison, they're often saddled with thousands of dollars of debt, fees, fines, court costs, and many states are now required to pay back the cost of your imprisonment and accumulate back child support. And then get this, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished.
100%?
Yes, 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all these fees, fines, court costs, and accumulated back child support. Yeah, so here you are, one of the lucky few who actually managed to get a job, and up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. What do we expect these folks to do? What is the system designed to do? It's clearly seems designed to send people right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens about 70% of the time. 70% of released prisoners return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with just surviving, just making it in the legal economy and mainstream society are so immense. But what's interesting is that most people I found who have spent time in prison will tell me that, as bad as all these forms of legal discrimination are, as, humiliating as these forms of discrimination are, even those who've been denied the right to vote and know that they are ineligible to ever serve again on a jury, will say that these, formal kind of legal forms of discrimination are not the worst of it. It's actually not the worst of it. It's the stigma. It's the stigma associated with being branded a felon, branded a criminal that follows you for life. That's the worst of it. The shame of having to beg your grandma for a place to sleep at night because nowhere else will take you in. The shame and stigma is so severe that many people who are branded felons try to pass, right? During the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks would try to pass as white to avoid the shame and stigma, associated with race in the Jim Crow era. Well, today, many people branded, labeled criminals try to pass, not just by lying to their employers, or housing officials, but by lying to their friends, their family members,
Wow.
even loved ones. There's a fascinating study that was published in the book. It was an ethnographic study that was published in the book called Doing Time on the Outside. The study was of mass incarceration, a community hardest hit by mass incarceration in Washington, D.C. And in these communities, the researchers found that they could not find one person, in these neighborhoods where literally nearly every house or apartment had someone who was either in prison or recently released from prison. Places where you would think that imprisonment, incarceration would just be normal, a fact of life everyone would be talking about. But even in these communities hardest hit by mass incarceration, they couldn't find one person who would fully come out to their friends, neighbors, or loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their family members. There was still such shame associated with being branded a felon, no matter how minor the offense, that people would try to keep it quiet and not let the relatives know or their neighbors know unless it was absolutely necessary. And it's this silence about the devastation caused to individuals and communities by mass incarceration that has made it possible for the system to emerge with relatively little political resistance.
The stigmatization has caused a silence on the part of really the victims and those closest to the victims. Is that somewhat of what you're saying, that it's caused people not to voice it and mobilize against it and make it a public policy issue?
Yes, I think that there's so much shame associated with being thought of as a criminal, and so much of the logic of this new system has been internalized by the people who are its targets. I find in many of these communities, everyone acknowledges that the drug war is racist and the criminal justice system is biased, but there's still this sense of, it still must be my fault that I'm in this situation. It still must be the fault of my son or my daughter or my mother, my father. There's still this sense that, I must have done something wrong. I must have been some way that I can avoid this. And that's why, I really focus on the war on drugs in this book because, there's a couple of reasons. One is that, the drug war has been the primary engine of mass incarceration. Most people think that, the prison boom has been caused by spikes in violent crime or increasing crime rates generally. It's just not true. Not true at all. Crime rates have fluctuated over the years and, are today at historical lows, but incarceration rates over the past 30 years have consistently soared. Incarceration rates have moved independently of crime rates. Whether or not crime is going up and down in any particular community or nationwide, incarceration rates have consistently soared. And the engine of this vast prison expansion has been the drug war. Drug convictions are the primary reason for the increase in our prison population. About two-thirds of the increase in the federal system between 1982 and 2000 was due to drug convictions, and more than half of the increase in the state system. Now, this drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have consistently shown that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely than whites to use or sell illegal drugs. Or sell. That defies, our basic racial stereotypes about who drug dealers are. The reality is that drug dealing happens everywhere in America, on college campuses and rural areas, in suburban communities. Drug dealing happens everywhere, but the drug war has been fought almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in millions of black and brown people being branded felons for criminal activity that is largely ignored in middle-class white communities and on college campuses. What has happened today is that there has been a roundup, a sweeping of poor communities of color, primarily for nonviolent and drug-related offenses, minor offenses that happen in other communities with the same frequency, but the enforcement has been concentrated in poor communities of color, resulting in staggering rates of incarceration and grossly disproportionate rates of incarceration, particularly for black and brown men. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders convicted and sentenced to prison have been African American. There's just absolutely no justification for this. So, all people make mistakes. All people experiment, and all people of all colors, I should say, make mistakes, experiment with drugs. But only some of us are expected to forfeit our lives as a result.
Now, could I interject a question here about intentionality?
Absolutely.
Because I did hear you say at the beginning that the system, this new architecture, this new Jim Crow of mass incarceration does not require malicious intent or conscious bias, I think was the term that you used. But would you say that the people who make policies, who determine where the drug raids are going to occur within the police apparatus, they've known these statistics for quite some time. They know that where people who are white live versus where people who are not white live, they know. So when they direct their people to go out and conduct these raids where black people live, they are doing that intentionally.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, don't get me wrong. I think that there has been quite a fair amount of conscious bias and the exploitation of racial divisions by politicians and people within law enforcement. In fact, I describe, in the first chapter of the book that, from the outset, the drug war had relatively little to do with the drug crime. The current drug war was officially announced by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually declining, not rising. It was declared a few years before crack hit the streets in Los Angeles and later ravaged ghetto communities across America. From the outset, the drug war was part of a grand and highly successful Republican Party strategy of using racially coded political appeals on issues of crime and welfare to attract poor and working-class white voters who were resentful of and threatened by many of the gains of the civil rights movement, especially desegregation, busing, and affirmative action. Keep in mind that it was poor and working-class whites, not wealthy whites, that had, their world rocked by the civil rights movement and by desegregation. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, and their kids weren't competing for the first time with African Americans for working class jobs and fire departments and police departments. It was poor and working class whites who felt threatened because they were suddenly forced to compete with a group of people that they had been long taught were their inferiors. And it was their kids who were being bussed across town and forced to compete for scarce jobs with a whole new group of people for the first time. So Republican strategists and pollsters found that they could be highly successful in appealing to these voters, particularly in the South, through these racially coded political appeals on issues of crime and welfare. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Nixon's former White House chief of staff, he said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." Mm-hmm. Well, a few years after Ronald Reagan officially declared the drug war, crack hit the streets in inner city communities, and the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff who were responsible for publicizing inner city crack babies, crack mothers, crack whores, and crack-related violence. The goal was to make inner city crack use and violence a media sensation, bolstering public support for the war and turning, what had been a rhetorical war into a literal one. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, television sets were saturated with images of black and, brown drug dealers and offenders and crack babies. And Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove that they could be even tougher, on these black drug criminals and their Republican counterparts. And it was Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what, his Republican predecessors had ever even dreamed possible. And it was the Clinton administration, again, an attempt to, win over those so-called white swing voters who, supported and enacted laws barring, drug offenders from public housing for a minimum of 5 years and authorizing discrimination against them in housing for the rest of their lives and denying them, food stamps forever. Much of the basic architecture of, this new caste system can be traced to the Clinton administration, in the effort of the so-called New Democrats to prove they could be even kind of tougher on the dark-skinned pariahs as the Republicans. So this whole system, in many ways, I think, is very much traceable to racial politics and the exploitation of racial anxieties and vulnerabilities for political gain. And once the wheels were set in motion, it's no surprise that law enforcement chose to wage this war almost exclusively in ghetto communities. In both the media and in the political discourse, the enemy in this war had been defined as black or brown.
Right, and the willingness to define it and to go along with that definition was at the ready. One of the things I wanted to discuss, which you've already touched on, was the effect that it has on everybody. I live in a part of San Diego that has more black people per capita than any other part of it, and so I know the effect that it has. And we haven't gotten a chance to talk about the way the whole system is stacked against black males, particularly as they just maybe happen to be walking to the taco shop.
Yes.
Getting pulled over, their odds of just getting pulled over and asked to provide this, provide that, and then if they happen to be arrested, what are their odds of actually being detained further and charged, and what are their odds of being sent into a diversion program like their white counterpart is likely to be versus actually, being pressured to plea bargain and then do time, all of those things. But once that's happened, it has such a devastating effect, and your book does talk about that, on their families, on their girlfriends, their wives, their children, because now what you have is you're the male that is supposed to be trying to be a father is not around anymore. And you talk. I'll just let you talk about that. I think you do it better than me.
Well, you've done it quite well. You're absolutely right. There's so much talk, in the media today about, where are the black fathers, the missing black fathers, the missing black husbands, as though, generations of black men have just kind of opted out of family life for no apparent reason. And what's missing from, this debate and this, public discussion is often the recognition that, black men didn't just walk out on their families voluntarily in most cases. They're often taken away in handcuffs, and locked in cages, years, sometimes decades of their life, and frequently for relatively minor, nonviolent, or drug-related offenses. And then once they're released, they're saddled with criminal records that make it nearly impossible to find employment or housing, contribute meaningfully to a family. And, this, the destruction of black family in the United States, is highly linked to the emergence of mass incarceration. The odds of a black child being raised by both parents were actually higher during slavery than they are today. And that
Can you repeat that?
Yes. The odds of a black child being raised by both parents were higher during slavery than they are today. And that is due in no small part to the mass incarceration of black men and, their inability as a result of being branded felons to contribute meaningfully to a family unit. So, I think that, the discussion of, where have all the black men gone, has just done an incredible disservice to, our public understanding around what really has gone on in the communities hardest hit by mass incarceration. You look at many black colleges today, and in some of them, there's 3 times more black women there than black men. And, people shrug their shoulders about what happened to all the young black men. And, our criminal justice system has in so many ways destroyed the potential of generations of young black men. And, again, I think I really want to emphasize that it's not simply a function of these young men choosing crime. It's not that simple. Barack Obama has admitted to plenty of illegal drug use, lots, in fact. And if Barack Obama had been arrested and treated like a common criminal, if he hadn't been insulated by, being raised in Hawaii and going to, an overwhelmingly white university, if he hadn't been insulated in those ways, if he had been, a young kid in the ghetto doing lots of drugs, what would happen to him? What are the odds that he would be president of the United States today? It's far more likely that he would be cycling in and out of prison, having been branded a felon, and unable to participate meaningfully in the mainstream economy and society. He might even be denied the right to vote, far from being president of the United States. So, I think what's critically important for people to understand is that, all people, especially young people, make mistakes, commit crimes, and only some, though, have been asked to forfeit their lives as a result. And that is the reality for so many young people of color in the United States.
Wow. I was not aware. That's not true. I was aware. I didn't know the statistic, though. I did not know that the United States, as we call it, has an incarceration rate that is 6 to 8 times, is that the correct figure? 6 to 8 times as large as its nearest competitor?
Well, I think Russia it may not be quite that many times as compared to Russia, but yes, other Western democracies in general, yes, it is 6 to 8 times higher incarceration rate of most other Western democracies. I think because prisons are out of sight and out of mind, during the Jim Crow era, there were whites-only signs everywhere. Black people were forced to sit on the back of the bus. The caste system was very visible. It was in your face. But here, prisoners are out of sight, out of mind. And when they return, they're generally returned to racially segregated ghettos and remain out of sight and out of mind for, many mainstream whites as well as people of color who have managed to escape the caste system. And so I think the sheer scale of mass incarceration, the sheer scale of the system of control is difficult for many people to comprehend. But the reality is that there are more African Americans under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. And if we were just to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, a time when many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high. But if we were to go back to the bad old days of the 1970s, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. The emergence of this system in such an incredibly short period of time, the span of just a couple of decades, is now so deeply entrenched in our economic structure. More than 1 million people depend for their livelihood on the existence of this system. And many benefit, profit directly from the expansion of the system, meaning that, any effort to downsize it is going to meet with fierce resistance. And that's why I argue that piecemeal policy reform has little hope for success.
But did you not also say, which I found really, really intriguing and important, that you did not think that litigation was the way to correct this problem, because litigation is part of the architecture. Litigation is part of the architecture itself, and so that it cannot correct this problem. Is that what?
Yes. I devote a whole chapter of the book to showing how the Supreme Court has essentially immunized this new system of control from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it once protected the institutions of slavery and Jim Crow from meaningful legal challenge or judicial scrutiny. The U.S. Supreme Court has made it virtually impossible to prove racial bias at any stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining to sentencing. It has closed the courthouse doors to challenges on the grounds of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process. And a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the Supreme Court has explicitly stated that no matter how severe the racial disparities, no matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence is of discrimination, unless you can produce evidence of conscious racial bias, the kind of evidence of overt bigotry that is nearly impossible to come by in the age of colorblindness, where everybody knows better than to say, oh, I stopped him because he was black. Oh, I asked for the death penalty because he was black. Oh, I refused to, give him a lighter sentence because he was black. Because that kind of evidence is almost never available today. The requirement by the Supreme Court that only conscious evidence of intentional bias will suffice to prove unequal treatment under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution effectively immunizes, the criminal justice system from meaningful challenge. It has, expressly stated it does not matter how severe the racial disparities are. If you cannot find that smoking gun, you're out of luck. So challenging racial bias in the criminal justice system through litigation is a largely futile endeavor. But I also think it's a mistake for advocates to think that the system can be undone through a litigation strategy for another reason, which is that, nothing short of a mass movement has any hope for overturning the basic public consensus and ideology which underlies this system of control. If we aren't successful in overturning the public consensus, the public consciousness which supports the system of control, it will rebound, even if the Supreme Court were to hand down some grand proclamation reversing mass incarceration. Most people don't realize that Brown versus Board of Education, though widely celebrated as this great victory for civil rights, accomplished essentially nothing in the South. A full decade after Brown versus Board was decided, almost no schools were desegregated in the South. Less than 1% of schools in the South were desegregated a full decade after Brown versus Board was decided. Virtually nothing happened in the South in response to Brown versus Board of Education. It took a mass movement to bring Jim Crow to its knees. It took a civil war to end slavery. It took a mass movement to end Jim Crow. And those who think that, far less is required to end mass incarceration are engaging in fanciful thinking, really a form of denial. This new system of control is going to require, a social movement of the size, scale, depth, and courage of the movement that was begun in the 1960s and left unfinished. That is the work that remains to be done. And while reform efforts are worthwhile, ultimately, if those reform efforts are not linked to movement-building work that is about organizing the communities most affected by mass incarceration and changing public consciousness on the issues of race and the role of our criminal justice system in our society, what reforms are won may prove to be short-term, or the system will adapt. It will emerge again in new form, the same way convict leasing ultimately replaced slavery, or it will be reborn the way mass incarceration replaced Jim Crow.
Right. I have several questions, but I have a full switchboard, so I think I'll probably get to ask one before the hands start to go up. The call-in number for this program, we are speaking with Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The publisher is The New Press. And got a hand shot right up, 2 hands, so I guess we'll go. If you're okay with taking calls right now, Ms. Alexander, or we'll go right to this. Oh, okay. One. I'm showing that your mic is open. You have a question for Ms. Alexander?
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can be heard, sir.
Thank you for taking my call, CREE. I got a question for your guest. After all the information you have gave to the public today, what are the reasons and why do you think white people continue to practice racism and white supremacy?
Well, I think it boils down to kind of what Frederick Douglass once said, that, power seeds nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. I think that people of every race, not just white folks, but people of every race have difficulty forfeiting their privilege. It is very tempting to try to rationalize whatever privileges or advantages you might have in society and allow yourself to believe that they are deserved. In our society, we tend to think of ourselves as essentially competitors with one another. That is, part of the kind of nature of hyper-capitalism is that, members of a society are encouraged to view each other as competitors and, a scramble for scarce resources, scarce jobs, scarce opportunities. And in a society that, views itself as, a nation of competitors and an environment of scarcity, those who have privilege, who have access to opportunity are going to want to rationalize their advantage and believe that their privileges are justified. And so I think, clearly in the United States, whites, especially white elites, have gone to great lengths to rationalize and justify their privilege and have not shown a willingness to give up their advantages easily.
111, did that answer your question, or did you have a follow-up?
No, go ahead. Thanks. I know you got a lot of callers.
Okay. Actually, I do have a lot of callers. 213, you had your hand up. You put it down, but now we have 478. 478, I am opening your mic. It is now open. Do you have a question for Ms. Alexander?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I have a question. I did some volunteer work at this, prison here, and I noticed when I went in that long story short, there's a lot of people getting paid off of the prison industrial complex. And I wanted to ask you, because as I go in there and I see, the dishwashing companies, the food that's being produced there, on top of everybody who works there, here, I'm in the South, it is Bell South or AT&T, and I think those calls are over like $1 or $2 a minute just to call collect. A lot of people, and, some of the companies are even, traded on stock exchanges. So being that there is a lot of money funneling into the prison industrial complex, how do you as an attorney, how do you reconcile that if this system does fall, that there's just going to be a lot of people out of work, but at the same time the system was set up. Hold on, because I'm trying to breathe through this thing. The system was still set up to make money off of, these people, but at the same time, if the system falls, there's going to be a lot of people out of work, being that you're an attorney. How do you reconcile that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Prisons have become big business. It's not just private prison companies, which, are now listed on the New York Stock Exchange and are doing quite well in a time of economic recession. But, as you described, it's all the companies that serve prisons as well, phone companies like AT&T, the dishwashing companies, healthcare providers, private healthcare providers, those who make stun guns, and, supply law enforcement, prison guards with, their weaponry. There's just a whole host of corporate interests that benefit from mass incarceration and profit from the caging of human beings. And then, of course, there's the prison guard unions. Prison guard unions are the largest and often most powerful lobbying organizations in many states. And these prison guard unions, they don't just lobby for better pay. What else do they lobby for? They lobby for three strikes laws. They lobby for harsh mandatory sentences because they want to guarantee that there will always be high demand for their job. The way they, achieve job security is ensuring that there will always be a growing number of prisoners, so their services will always be needed. So there, it's just a whole host of groups and businesses and interests that are invested in not just the maintenance of the system, but its continued expansion. So I think what we have to recognize is that as we build a movement to dismantle mass incarceration, that those who resist, the downsizing of our prison population, they're not going to argue, we need to keep more people in prison so that I can have a good profit margin on my dishwashing business. No, they're not going to make that argument. The prison guard union isn't going to say, we need to keep more people in prison so that I can have a job. No, instead, those groups will lobby for harsh sentences and urge their politicians to stay tough on crime using racially, divisive rhetoric, the racially coded get tough political appeals, and by encouraging the media to seize on, sensational violent crimes as a means of justifying the continued imprisonment of millions of nonviolent and drug-related offenders. So that's the dynamic that we have to deal with. I firmly believe that in the movement that we build to end mass incarceration, we have to, again, overturn the public consciousness that gives rise to that get tough sentiment, but we also have to be willing to do the hard work of movement building for job creation, in poor communities of color as well as in rural white communities that house large prisons. Some of these rural white communities depend on prisons as their source, their economic base, much in the same way that, plantations, served as the economic base for rural communities once upon a time. So this has to be a human rights movement that seeks, jobs, employment, health care, in addition to the dismantling of a punitive prison state.
I do want to honor Ms. Alexander's request that the interview only be 1 hour long. We do have two more questions. Do you have time for two short questions, Ms. Alexander?
Sure.
Okay. Sure. 213, you've had your hand up for quite some time. You're on the air with Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. Do you have a question? Oh, 213, are you with us? You muted your phone accidentally. Okay. Let's go to 850. 850, I'm showing your mic is open. Do you have a question for Ms. Alexander?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, you can be heard, sir.
Okay. Great show, great work, very timely. My question is simply this. Short of the mass movement that you mentioned, which I totally agree, what is the conclusion of this? 10 years from now, if this thing keeps growing like a cancer, and I know you're not a prophet, but in your opinion, where does this end? Where are we 10 years from now? Thank you.
Well, fortunately, this year was the first year that the prison population did not expand. Part of the reason is that many state legislatures are, facing budget crises. States like California are literally going bankrupt because they have spent billions of dollars on prisons, starving their school systems, and they find themselves now unable even to maintain basic infrastructure in the state because they have been willing to invest such a large percentage of their budget on law enforcement and prisons. And so for the first time, due to this economic crisis, we see states large and small finding that they can no longer afford to continue expanding prison populations at the same rate that they had been. Now, of course, if things change economically, it may once again become feasible again for the pace of incarceration to escalate. My prediction is that we will plateau, that the rate of incarceration will not continue to increase at the same rate it has in the past, but that we'll reach a plateau and we will become, relatively comfortable as a nation, warehousing a couple million people in prison who are overwhelmingly black and brown. And, even if that becomes the reality, it will mean that, generations of young black and brown men, will find themselves behind bars, labeled felons, and, our communities will disintegrate even further. I think the most troubling trend that we have seen is that increasingly women are the targets of the drug war. African American women, Latinas, are now, the fastest growing group in our prison system. And as a result, already fragile black families, most of which don't have fathers at home, are finding mothers removed and placed in distant prisons. And, these kids, what happens to them? Well, some of them go and live with grandparents, but thousands are finding their way into foster care. So, the increased incarceration of women in the drug war and the expansion of that war, for women with children, I think, poses extraordinary risks for a community that is already fragile and has been decimated by mass incarceration for the past 2 decades.
Well, thank you for your time, Ms. Alexander. I do want to thank you for coming on the show, and I want to ask you one final question, which I think you would agree with, but this is it. You have said that if we just do a piecemeal repair of this, what many people call the prison industrial complex, what some people call the bankrupt criminal justice system, and I frankly don't see how that can ever exist, a justice system that's criminal. I prefer to call it the criminal adjudication system. But if we just do that, that the system of racism, white supremacy in this part of the world will likely morph into something else that suits the times, just as this one has morphed from Jim Crow, and Jim Crow morphed from slavery. So would you agree that while we do have to work on this area, nothing short of replacing the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice will suffice to keep it from morphing into something else?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the basic thesis of the book, which is that if we want to do more than just end mass incarceration, if we want to end the history and cycle of the rebirths of caste in America, we can't just, set our sights on reforming the criminal justice system. We have to change our basic understandings about race. We have to build a truly compassionate and racially inclusive society. And that may sound, daunting and overwhelming, but, I like to remind folks, keep in mind, in the early 1950s when civil rights activists were arguing that, we should try to build a mass movement to end Jim Crow in the South, they were dismissed as crazy. People said there's no way Jim Crow can be defeated. It's, too deeply entrenched in the social, economic, and political fabric of the South. There's no way you can build a movement to end Jim Crow. And then, sure enough, just a little more than a decade later, a mass movement brought Jim Crow to its knees. So we have the capacity. We have the capacity to do the kind of movement building that is necessary, to raise public consciousness, to break the silence, to do the hard work of organizing, to build another movement. But this movement has to be one that, cannot be bought off simply through affirmative action programs that benefit the few. This movement has to be committed to ensuring that all of us, every last one of us, is included in a vision for human rights and social justice, not just a lucky few.
Wonderful. You had indicated that there was some possibility that we could get you back on in the future to continue this conversation. I hope we'll be able to do that.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to.
Well, I will definitely extend that invitation to you. I want to thank you again and encourage all the listeners to go out and get a copy of Michelle Alexander's outstanding work. She is a professor of law at Ohio State University. I think she has a joint appointment with another institution affiliated.
The Kirwan Institute.
The Kirwan Institute. And I don't know when she's going to be going back and being in front of students, but right now we're lucky to have her in the public sphere, and I want to thank her again for joining us, and we look forward to having you again, Ms. Alexander. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Good evening.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night. Okay. Well, I'm going to play a short commercial and come back if people want to discuss the issues that were raised. I'm certainly anxious to do that, so I'll just take a quick 1.5-minute commercial, and we'll be right back.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At CounterRacism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by CounterRacism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Okay. Well, I would have liked to have had her for more time. She was gracious enough to give us an additional 8 to 10 minutes. We had originally scheduled a full 2-hour show, but she did have another commitment that she had to get to at 7 o'clock, and I understood that. And she did offer to come back at a later time so that we could discuss the issues that she raised in her book and in this conversation more comprehensively. I did really hear her say that it's not going to be enough just to get in front of some judges. the judges are the racist suspects themselves, or they are under the complete domination thereof. Hence, trying to undo it at that level is not going to work. And she actually concurred with the statement that nothing short of replacing the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice is going to solve the problem, because as I think it was Bird that called, as she raised the issue that, hey, what happens when we get rid of these prisons and they're the only employers of black folks where I live, or the major employer, and that sounds eerily like what a lot of people said about apartheid in South Africa. What do you mean you want to boycott us? What do you mean that you will not accept our products? All that's going to do is cause a lot of black people to be out of work, the few black people who do have jobs. Yeah, absolutely. That's not good enough. People need to be not mistreated, and people need to get help if they are the people who most need help in every area of people activity. And that's why you have to look at racism, white supremacy as a system, and she has a recognition of that. One of the things that I want to raise when she comes back, and I didn't think that this particular segment was the appropriate time to do it, was the use of words. I kind of raised it when I talked about the term criminal justice system, but there were terms that were used like racial justice. I don't know how anything racial can be just, nor do I, just in the same way that I don't know how a justice system can be criminal. The use of the words is very important, and as an attorney, since she knows that at least half of the words that are in any book of statutes are definitions themselves, I know that she would concur that the use of words, the definitions of words, are key to addressing any kind of problem that exists within this structure of racism, white supremacy. But I think her book is just, I wouldn't have had her on as an author if I didn't think the book was worth purchasing. So I would encourage everybody to go out and get it. But there are still 4 hands up, and I'm going to open all of your mics and see if we can have a somewhat organized discourse, because I can't keep track of who called first and that type of thing. I think I have 850's mic open. I have 111's mic open, 213, and 478. So if any of you have something that you would like to share, jump right in. And you can be heard. Who am I speaking with?
Yeah, this is 850.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no, excellent show. This is one of those topics that I guess before I became a student of Mr. Fuller's work, it was one of those things that you kind of observe, but as she stated, you don't really see a prison on your day-to-day, walk through life. But it's kind of like this undercurrent where that there is a lot of people that look just like you that are somewhere, and and they're stuck there. They can't get out. And if they do get out, they pretty much, it's designed to send them right back to where they came from. So I just want to say excellent show, excellent book. I got to get my hands on it. Yeah, it's my comment.
Well, thank you. It's pretty scary. There's no check anymore. The Supreme Court has taken off all checks on police discretion, and discretion is that word. It's a very, very critical word if you're a victim of racism, white supremacy, because just about any situation, I'm saying just about because I'm not all-knowing and all-seeing, but I will tell you that I have never encountered a single situation, a single rule in which somebody didn't have some discretion to disregard that rule. So at every stage that a policy or a decision is made in any area of your life, if it's in a grocery store, whether or not to cash your check, if it's in a bank, whether or not to let you have access to your funds, although you have no ID, if it's whether you're walking along on the sidewalk and a police officer happens to smell some marijuana, or in the courtroom when you've admitted that you have. There is somebody somewhere, the ultimate person who has the decision and the discretion as to what to do about that. Is going to be somebody who's is a white person, if I haven't said something that's redundant there. But there's always, always, always discretion. And the Supreme Court has taken off all checks of the abuse of discretion on police officers. They can pull anybody over, whether on foot or in any type of vehicle at any time, and just swoop them in, knowing that whether or not the person committed the crime, there's still a great likelihood that they will be pressured into plea bargaining. There are so many of us that are hurt by this. There are so many children that are not born. There are so many children who are born but don't have their daddies around. One of the statistics she cited in her book was that the stereotype of the black male who has no regard for his offspring is false, just like the stereotype of the higher drug rate and the higher rate of selling drugs is amongst black people is a false one. In fact, statistics show that black males of every color group black males are the most likely of all color groups to sustain contact with their children if they are not living in the same household. So even under the toughest conditions, black males are still trying the best they can to attempt to be fathers. So it's just that the effort is made just almost impossible by these people who know exactly what they're doing. It's intentional. But I haven't. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. This is 213. My name is Jason. Earlier, I was going to ask her a question, but I didn't realize my phone was still on mute.
I was trying to get you back.
Yeah, I definitely want to congratulate you too. It was a very great show. But one thing I wanted to throw out there, and me and Michelle we've discussed this through email a couple of times, is the field of criminology. And I think a lot of people need to really enlighten themselves on the field of criminology, because most, if not almost all of her book, the things that she had written on and shed light on, those issues have been getting covered in the field of criminology for decades. And the information has been out there for decades. It's just that I think society as a whole, society doesn't quite know about that field. They don't know about the importance of the field of criminology and how that field is basically the only field that can address these issues, forthrightly. Now, you have the legal academy, but the legal academy can only address things from a law perspective. Criminology addresses it from both the law and the sociological perspective, namely critical criminology and radical criminology. And a book that I would like to throw out there for you guys, if you want to look into it, is by Jeffrey Ryman. I believe it's called The Poor Get Prison and the Rich Gets Richer. And that book is a critique.
I'm sorry. Repeat the title of that book.
The Poor Gets Prison and the Rich Gets Richer. And and even if you were to, let's say, go into Amazon.com or any other type of site and type that in, you will see loads of other books that are similar to the sentiments that are written within that book. And I would say for people to really, really, really familiarize yourself with the field of criminology. That field, that's why it exists. It exists to look at the prison system. It exists to look at the sociological, connections as it relates to crime. But also it exists to look at the law. So, and that's my background in criminology. That's why, I always speak on these issues, even on my Facebook page, from that vantage point. And like I said, when we look at it from that academic vantage point, from the criminological standpoint, then we will be able to better understand these issues. We will be able to better knock down the stereotypes, because most of her sources went back to criminologists that have spoken on these issues, especially as it relates to the prison system. Dr. Todd Clare is known for writing exclusively on that and different changes and reforms that need to actually take place within the prison system. But above all, we have to look at the sociological effects of this and push it out there. And quite certainly, maybe criminologists as well should be doing a better job with pushing their works out there. But sadly, majority of the time, their work only it gets published in academic journals. I don't think there are many out there like Ryman who actually dared to write a book on it. But like I said, I think we need to look at both academies, and if we can put both academies together somehow, some way, I think the movement that she speaks of would really be a movement with which to be reckoned with.
No, that's very... Go ahead, sir.
The criminology is focused more on the aftermath of white supremacy, but in these books, I just want to ask this question to the gentleman. Are these white studies on how they manipulate the law, or are this just basically a summary of what people are doing?
Well, that's what the legal academy can only do. Actually, criminology is not just a response to the aftermath, and that's why, again, I put the book out there and said what I have stated. You really want to educate yourself on the field in its fullest capacity, because, like I've stated, not only do we cover, yes, the aftermath of crime, but we cover the who, what, where, why, and how of all of it. We cover why it happens, what allows it to happen. We look at race, gender, and class in criminology. Again, I suggest you really start to familiarize yourself with that field and look at everything that it has to offer. And the book that I stated will definitely do that for you. There's another book called Is Justice Blind by Matthew Robinson. That's another book that you may want to go out and find. It should be cheap. I believe he written it back in 2001. These are two great books right here that will begin to help you, stimulate your thought process when it comes to these issues as it pertains to criminology in the prison system and law.
Matthew Robinson, and the name of the book was what?
Is Justice Blind. He has a Facebook page as well.
Okay. You know, what I was thinking of is that in public policy generally, because criminology, it seems like it touches on public policy.
All of it.
Yeah. How people with official forms of power and titles and so on decide to recommend and then implement policies, and in so doing, it's kind of like it's very, very similar to environmental impact studies. Just like environmental impact studies have to be done on the physical environment, environmental impact studies are done on what the effects are going to be on people. That's how they're able to project out how many jobs are going to be created, how much welfare, how much of the budget needs to be allocated to public welfare, how many schools need to be built, how many prisons need to be built, et cetera, how many hospitals need to deal with this, with that. When laws are made, when policies are implemented, these people know what the effects are going to be and on what kinds of people before they ever enact them. They know that.
Yes.
And this is the world over. So these things do not happen. Sure, there's the law of unintended consequences, but with the scientific mind that these white supremacists have, most of, 90-something%, I'm going to say, of the effects have been intentionally designed and engineered. They know it. They plan for it to happen just this way.
Yes.
Yes.
And again, it's the job of criminologists to go out there and investigate these matters, because, quite frankly, lawyers are trained to just know the letter of the law. Now, you're going to have your critical lawyers out there like Michelle Alexander. You even have Paul Butler and various other attorneys out there who, joined the legal academy, and they write on things in a highly critical manner. However, at the end of the day, the credentials aren't quite there for them to look at it from that sociological standpoint. And although they may have the training, when it comes to the two academies, the Academy of Criminology is best equipped to look at those issues from that vantage point. And like you said, yes, these laws are made to address a certain population, and that's basically it. And it's justified by the law itself, as she has stated, when it comes to the discriminatory effects of being labeled a felon. So once something is drafted into law, it really doesn't matter what the effects are, because it's justified and it's basically legally binding, because that's how the law is in this country. We live by the rule of law. You do not question the law once it is prescribed and written and enacted. It just stands.
Right. So after you did your studies, why do you think white people practice racism, white supremacy?
Why do I think white people practice? Well, it's very much like she stated, like Michelle actually advocated. It seems to be, in my opinion, as a black criminologist, it just seems to be embedded within the social and moral fabric of America. And until it's completely eradicated and done away with, it will continue to just re-implement itself in a new way. Like, as the eras change, for example, we left, if you go back to slavery when blacks were freed, right? They brought about the 13th Amendment. Then what came against that? The slave codes. And then what came against that? They had to bring forth more laws, namely the 14th Amendment, to help back against that again. And then sooner, back up in the 60s, we had Jim Crow, you know. And then what fought against that? Well, the modern-day criminal justice system. So it's always going to be something that comes into place to fight back resistance. If the resistance that we can bring forth to expunge these activities isn't strong enough. And what we oftentimes find, again, is that people will do these movements. We'll have our movements for equal rights, right, and civil rights. But once we achieve whatever it is we feel we need to achieve, then we back off. You know, we don't stay strong on the issue. And this is why, again, certain people get back into Congress and they just reenact the same policy over and over and over again. And another law, actually, if you go back into history, the Pigs Law, is nothing more, the drug law as we have today is nothing more than a reflection of the Pigs Law back in the day when they used to discriminate against black males for allegedly stealing domestic animals. So it's a reflection of a law that was in place in the past. So they're nothing more than old tricks being, you know, remodified to fit current society, but they have to do this in such a way where they don't appear to be racist. And so again, until we can eradicate that racist tendency there within our lawmaking process, then it's going to continue.
So you're saying the reason why people...
I'm sorry, let me take a privilege here. 213, is it your contention that racism only exists in this part of the world that we call the United States, or do you recognize that it's something that is practiced all over the globe?
I actually recognize it because I've seen and read studies and spoken to criminologists from all around the world, and this is something that exists worldwide, you know? It exists worldwide. And again, it is embedded with the structure, the educational structure, and also pretty much the whole entire entertainment structure as well as the news stations or whatever have you. Everything is pretty much reinforced through almost every avenue that they know, basically society basically dictates to, or gains dictation from, rather.
Okay, so 850, I think you were trying to ask a question before I interrupted you.
Oh, no, it was 111. No, I was...
Oh,
his conclusion is because they're mistreating people around the world because of an advantage they want to have, or do you think it's deeper than that?
Well, when we use the word advantage, we might want to watch out because it's not an advantage that they've gained, in a rightful manner, right? What they do is they utilize politics and the so-called rule of law and other different mechanisms that they have in place within that, the ruling structure of that society to sustain such privilege and power. And so what they have to do, and this has been seen throughout history, if you look at other countries, even before the time of the United States, you have to have a way to suppress those who are considered the undesirables. And the best way to do that is through the method of politics, right? And so the more and more people we label felon within the black community, the less and less power politically that these people will have. The same thing is actually happening now with the war on immigration. Because now, actually, it was a provision within the Arizona bill, and other states are on their way to enact the exact same policy. But there's a provision in it that basically labels people a felon if you were to harbor illegal aliens. So you have to find a way to suppress the undesirables to the point whereby they have no power, and to the point where they are psychologically discharged and so concealed within their social strain that they haven't the slightest clue where to go, what to do, and basically, just simply no recourse. So this is something, like I said, that if you look back throughout history, you'll see it there. It's just that in modern day time, they have to fashion in such a way where it doesn't quite appear to be, but it's there. It's more so under the surface now.
So, as a criminologist, you mentioned that the facts that have been raised in this book, The New Jim Crow, that those facts have been known for decades by people.
For decades, yes.
Okay.
These ideas have been known, yes.
And I'm aware that the fact that black people don't use or sell drugs at any higher rate than any other group of people, especially white people, that fact has been known, and in fact, it has been acknowledged on news programs for a couple of decades. And yet, the popular image persists because propaganda is more powerful than academic discourses. And the people who intend for this policy to keep being implemented and stay in force understand that. So it doesn't matter that they know the truth. The networks still portray these images that support the incarceration, the greater incarceration of black folks based on this perception that they deserve it because we use and or sell drugs at a greater rate, even though they know it's not true.
Yeah, and modern day white supremacists knows this because, again, you have to fashion your racist policies in such a way where you don't quite appear to be what you truly are. And this is why there is never an uproar from these people when it comes to this, this false identifying, if you will, of blacks in the media, because they know that it goes to help their cause. In modern day times, everything is pretty much psychological. And what you have is, as a result of the media tricks that we have out there, you also begin to see certain blacks themselves or people from, disenfranchised persons themselves beginning to reinforce these negative stereotypes. They actually begin to own up to them, even though they aren't true. They're not factual. So it's the battle today is more psychological, I would say, than anything else. So you are correct.
Okay. Now let me ask you another question. This question is for you, and it is also for anyone who's familiar with Mr. Fuller's book and has heard Mr. Fuller speak quite a bit on the subject of staying out of greater confinement, because we define this global system of racism, white supremacy, as confinement in and of itself, because it confines and constricts the activities that we as people who are not white can engage in. But when we're talking about actually being confined by walls, actual physical walls, that then would be a greater level of confinement for people who are victims of racism and white supremacy. Okay, now this is what Mr. Fuller says. Mr. Fuller says, yes, we know that they have a prison bed. Somebody's got some noise going on in the background, so if that's you, if you could mute your phone, that would be appreciated. Recognizing that the white supremacists have a prison bed waiting for you as a black male when you are born, or as Ms. Alexander said, increasingly even black females, you should do everything that you can to stay away from greater confinement, even if we know that the same things that you would do would get you in greater confinement would not get a white person in greater confinement. Stay away from it, because that is the nature of the war. And that the only thing that we should ever be confined for is for asking for help. We should never be confined for selling any drugs. We should never be confined, and having actually done it, not being falsely accused of it. We should never be confined for having harmed anyone physically or stolen anything. But if we go out and we've done everything that we can to try to get gainful employment, to get a job, we've tried to do things in a way that does not violate what the statutes that they have on the law, and still cannot feed ourselves or our offspring or house ourselves adequately, you go out and you ask for what he calls a compensatory investment request. What they would tell us is begging. You simply go out and ask for help, which is what anybody, including the people who just got the bailouts on Wall Street and so on, did when they ran out of money. So when we run out of money, we go out and we ask for help, not from each other because we don't have it. So don't hit me over the head or wait for me at the ATM machine or outside of 7-Eleven asking me, another black person, for some help. But go where the white people have the money, where a $10 bill is about the same to them as a quarter is to me, and ask them gently and nicely for help. And if, as a result of that, they put you in jail, that should be the only thing that we should ever be confined for. And if we did that en masse, if we all did that, line the golf courses so that it made it an unpleasant activity to go out on Sunday morning to play golf, lined the Tony downtown districts on Friday nights where they go out to have a great time at the bars and the clubs, lined there with black people asking for help gently. Make that an entirely unpleasant activity for them because we're always asking for help where they're going to have fun. What effect do you think, the criminologist on the line or anybody who's familiar with Mr. Fuller's suggestion, what effect do you think that will have on trying to reform this, not reform, but to eliminate the system of racism and white supremacy with justice, and particularly this criminal adjudication system?
Hook me, bro. I said,
hello?
Can I be heard?
You can be heard, sir.
Okay. I think that would be constructive, and I would hope that it raises the consciousness of all people on the planet. But I guess we have to lead, especially in America, to change anything. So I think it'd be constructive.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, this is 850. Yeah,
okay, sir.
I would have to agree. And maybe I'm just biased towards the work of Mr. Fuller, but given the fact that nothing else is working, it's probably about time that we get involved in some serious compensatory work, because understanding or learning more about the criminal justice system, learning more about, at this point, whatever, is practically futile, because it defeats the whole. Well, I won't say it defeats the point, but they know this stuff, and we can learn it, but that's not the problem. The problem is the system, and as long as the system is intact, it matters not what I know. Therefore, it's high time to get into action, and what that action may be for the individual victim of racism, I mean, that person has to decide. However, yeah, we need to stay out of greater confinement by robbing and killing each other. I mean, not to say we should kill anybody, but come on. This system is maintained while I'm killing someone that looks just like me who's in the hull of the slave ship. It's ridiculous. So, yeah, you can't get it, go beg. If panhandling is illegal, yeah. And when you get in court, I've heard Mr. Fuller even mention it. If he got on the stand, he would tell them exactly that. It was an investment request, the same as Bill Gates does when he needs money to create a new version of Microsoft, the same thing that Enron and all those other corporations do. So, yeah, I think it's very constructive.
Appreciate that. We have a caller from Canada, 450. I have your mic open, but we also have a caller from 215 who had his hand up, or her hand up first. So 215, you're on the air.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. My name is Don Calypso. I wanted to say about earlier, as far as with the whole system of white supremacy, that I kind of ascribe to the view, to the hypothesis postulated by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, where she speaks of it as a global system for the purpose of preventing white genetic annihilation. And as a biologist myself, it does make sense because, I don't think it's so much a question that a lot of them do it out of malice. It's just, for them, it's a necessity for survival, because if you had a system of justice, as what Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. proposes, to replace white supremacy, then in a system of justice where people can interbreed freely based on character as opposed to just race, you will have a very drastic reduction of the white population, for the simple fact that for most phenotypical traits, when you have breeding between a white person and a non-white, the non-white traits are dominant. If you have that kind of free interbreeding for, let's say, 10 generations, where the bulk of the planet's population is non-white, you would effectively not wipe out the white population, but they would be severely reduced because they are a recessive trait. And with black individuals, their phenotype being dominant for the most part, this is why black folks are the greatest threat to white survival. And I think this is the true reason behind it. So even if we know the laws, even if we try to get our act right, the fact of the matter is, unless they accept the fact that, hey, we carry a recessive trait, it's okay, they will always try to find a way to oppress non-white people. That's my opinion.
Interesting. I definitely want to dialogue with you about that, but I'm also anxious to hear what our caller from Canada has to say. 450, you're on the air.
Good afternoon, WDV. Hi, CREE. Thank you very much for having your show. It's very important. The limited shows that we have talking about the system of white supremacy. And now I deal with a lot of the philosophies pertaining to white supremacy. Dr. Cresson Wilson's philosophy is very enlightening. There's a lot of truths that I feel are revealed. And Neely's Fuller's as well. I think perhaps a good method of displacing this racism obviously is spreading that knowledge, and I feel that a lot of the studies are pertaining to the United States and are relatable in other parts of the world, and most of the diaspora of African descent are not English speakers. Most of them, there's a whole lot of, there's a big population in an area known as Brazil, which speak Portuguese, and a lot of that literature is not translated, if you will. A lot of the diaspora is in a part of the world called France. The French speakers, most of Africa was colonized by the French. So a lot of that, we already know that most blacks, people are classified as blacks, don't know really of they might have an idea of a system, but they don't really have too much of an in-depth notion of the inner workings of that system. And most of that literature is in English. So that's really what I wanted to tackle, if you will. So thank you very much.
No, that's been of concern to me for some time, and I thank you for calling, sir, and raising that issue. I believe that the works need to be translated, but every time I raise that issue, someone tells me that, well, someone who's bilingual in English and French or English and Portuguese who subscribes to the idea, not everything that is in Mr. Fuller's code book, but the idea of codification, that somebody who's bilingual in those two languages will do it.
Exactly, but that just, I would feel that just slows down the spreading process. If I have to translate that to someone, most people are not bilingual, if you will. And now if I have to translate that to someone, where he could just pick up that knowledge on himself if it was translated in his native language, it would be much easier. Latin America, most African people that are really under a devastating, under a very oppressive system might only speak Spanish. You know, first and foremost, a lot of us are not even literate, but, you know, for the ones that are, you know, they're not necessarily bilingual. Now, the English language is the international business language, if you will, the most recognizable language, but a lot of people do not speak English in the whole world. So I think that's a big, big step, translating a lot of the important works that are available right now into the Spanish, Portuguese, French. I think that's the three basic, and obviously for other non-colored, for colored people like Mandarin, the other languages. But I think those three first languages, the languages of the slaves, if you will, if I could use that language, that term. I'm sorry. The language that were put on us in whether slavery or any type of segregation.
So I think you're right. I would like to. I would like to be able. Well, the only thing that's hard about it is the ethical issue for me is that I've wanted to do it in Spanish. I'm not bilingual, but I do know people who are fluent in both. And of course, they want to get paid to do it. The only thing is that we would have to have the consent of the author. So Mr. Fuller would have to consent to the copyright.
Exactly. And evidently, if you really wanted to dismantle the system, I don't think they would have an opposition to that. I mean, to translate something, obviously, okay, maybe it would cost something, but the charges are relatively, they're not astronomical to translate any books. So I'm sure there's a lot of other people that want to give their insight, and I thank you very much for accepting my call.
No, thanks for calling. I want to get back to. I actually want to discuss both the issues that the Canadian caller raised and the issue that the caller from 215 raised, which is concerning both the works of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing and also Mr. Fuller. One is they do need to be more widely disseminated. I think Mr. Fuller's work is a much more practical one in a sense that you don't have to know the whys of it to implement it. And in a sense, action is a form of behavior, is a form of language, so that there are people all over the world who know what black people in this part of the world did in the 1960s. Even if they didn't speak English, they were able to duplicate the behavior because they were able to see the behavior. So that if we were out there making compensatory investment requests and getting incarcerated for that and that only, assuming that the white supremacists were not able to shut down all visual transmission of that would be a behavior that could be transferred to any part of the world, not to say that the works themselves don't need to be translated. But as regard Dr. Welsing's theory, I think that she got the closest to the why of it. And the why is important because if it's going to be left up to us to solve this problem because white people just don't have the will to do it. They have the ability. They're the ones who are practicing it. So obviously they have the ability to not practice it.
It's not in their interest to solve it, though.
It isn't in their interest. So if it's going to be left up to us to solve it, then we want to solve it permanently, very similar to something that Ms. Alexander said. It's important to know the why of it, because if we don't get to the underlying reason as to why they practice, as to why they do what they do, it'll be too easy to get tricked into believing that they will stop, that they recognize that it's in their interest to stop. There will be too many of us who will believe it, who will believe that they now recognize that it is in their interest. For instance, there's a book out right now called The Spirit Level. I interviewed the author. It's in the archives, by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. They're from the UK. And they say, hey, well, it's in our interest to see to it that the fellow members of our species are treated decently, because all people in places where there is not a lot of income inequality do better. Even the people at the top live longer, are happier, they have less physical health problems, less mental health problems. It isn't just the people who are being mistreated, but the people doing the mistreating actually do better because they have a higher level of trust, and that makes people healthier. Okay. So, there are a lot of people who are going to buy that. If the argument is just that they have an advantage that they don't want to give up, and that it's not something deeper than that they have an advantage economically, that's basically a resource issue. then when somebody white comes to me and says, yes, but I understand that having more resources doesn't help me live longer. Yes, but I understand that having more resources doesn't make me happier. And then I, as a victim of racism and white supremacy, believe you, and then stop pressing counter-racism science and believe you and for however many decades. And then that just gives you more time to refine and make more precise and make better the system to repress me. We're right back. No, we're not right back where we started from. We're in a worse position. So I do believe understanding why is important. Now, as to whether or not Dr. Welsing's theory explains it, I think it explains it better than anyone else has. I think that it does lie in the area of sex because self-preservation, after self-preservation, reproduction is the strongest instinct. Okay. I do believe that it lies in the area of sex, and I think that her work is seminal and fundamental and important and maybe the most important thing that came out besides Mr. Fuller's work in the last century. I think she's located the area where it is, but for me, it doesn't completely explain it. And the reason it doesn't completely explain it, I've said probably several times, but, and I have written on this on my blog. At some point I'll put it to a printed page, is because if you're afraid of genetic annihilation, if that's truly your most fundamental fear, then you don't yourself go out and engage in copious amounts of sexual intercourse with black females. Why would you do that? So I scratched my head for a while, and then I realized, I think it is about sex. And to a certain extent, it may be about genetics, because what is sexually attractive generally tends to be the strongest genes. That's just generally the way evolution works in every species. So what's most sexually attractive probably is the strongest genetically. Could it be that in order to have access to sex, you have to have more resources, because all things being equal, otherwise the most physically attractive person is going to win and going to have access to the persons that you want to have access to sexually. But if you dominate all the resources, then you become more attractive, and you stifle the chances of the males and the females with whom you are competing who would otherwise beat you out. That's my hypothesis, that it's about sex, and that if they weren't in control of everything, especially, not everything, but I mean, if you look at the media making themselves look far more attractive physically than they actually are, far more fertile, etc. If it weren't for that, they would have trouble even having access to each other sexually. It's only because they have control of the resources that they've been able to dominate and brainwash us into looking at them. Otherwise, I don't even think I think they would get sloppy seconds, thirds, and fourths. That is my hypothesis. Now, how do you address that? I don't know. I'm sorry, sir. Go ahead.
That's great. I would agree. That makes a lot of sense. But what about, so you're basically saying that white people who want to stay recessive by reproducing babies, only reason they're doing that is to practice racism and white supremacy. Is that?
Yeah, I think that they have to have some members of the club. That's a more difficult issue. But I do know that a lot of these people who espouse the purity of their race, look at the numbers of them that are even on paper. Look at the numbers of them that have had lots and lots of sex with black people. So how much do they really believe that? It looks like it's a cheating game even with themselves. Do you know what I mean? It's like, we all agree that we're going to abstain from sex with black people. That's how we're going to run this thing. Nobody gets to cheat. But if they get in a position of power and the other white person's not looking, or if they're in such a position of power that they can do it anyway and bogart their way, they do it. I don't know. Does that make sense? I may have lost you. see, 111. Is that you? Okay, I'm trying to open 111. Did I lose you?
Yeah, my phone. I don't know what's going on, but I didn't quite hear what you said.
Oh, I said, okay, so you had asked the question as to why there are people who seem to be intent on retaining the genetic recessive traits. Is that correct?
Right.
I just wonder if they're really intent on doing that, except to the extent that they need some club members temporarily. But are they really concerned about successive generations? They may be concerned with having some, I think they're concerned with having some during their current generation and maybe during the generation of their white offspring because they care for their direct white offspring. But are they concerned about it going on in perpetuity? First of all, who's concerned about that? Who really is? I mean, how many people really think 7, 8 generations out as an evolutionary matter, number one? And number two, if they truly are sincerely interested in retaining that genetic trait, why is it that so many of them who are avowed white genetic purity people who are in Stormfront, who are in VNN, who were Strom Thurmond, just about any avowed white supremacist you can name who was really against all this, all of them were copulating like rabbits and with black women. Why is that?
Well, see, in my opinion, I believe it's more of the masses of white people who continue to produce more offspring, knowing that their trait is recessive, is because of religion. They think that Jesus is white, and I believe it's more about their faith, and that's how the white supremacist uses that to manipulate them. And the ones who step outside of their race, yeah, they still accept them to a certain extent, but they still, just like they said about the black people with the felony, they still have that, I guess you want to say, looked down upon by their own people. They bring around a black guy or have offspring that's biracial. Barack Obama definitely touched on that when he was a kid, so I think that still has a play in it. But I think it's about their faith. They think Jesus is the white guy that's actually giving them their power to be supreme.
No, that I will have to think about, because I do know that religion and your image of God has a lot to do with what your image of reality is, and yet, there are people who say that they, don't believe in, say, for instance, intervening in the will of God in terms of who's born and who's not born, and somehow they find a way to rationalize their way to birth control or abortion. I say all that to say that there is a psychological. We're going to stop streaming live in 1 minute, but I'm going to stay on the air for just a little bit more. There is the power of psychological programming through propaganda in the form of religious images, but evolutionary programming, which is neurological, which is biological, is very strong. And so what you find sexually attractive, it seems to me, if that's biologically and evolutionarily programmed, is probably going to override the propaganda. But I mean, I could be incorrect.
But CREE, can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah, CREE. Something you said, and I think it makes a lot of sense. You said maybe they're cheating themselves, and when you say that, I can't help but think of the title of a book by Dr. Bobby E. Wright. Are you familiar?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Psychopathic personality.
It's kind of a dumb question. I should have known you were. But just in rereading his essays, I can't, and with what you just said, I can't help but think that, yes, on a certain level, they know that, this, what I am doing with this non-white person, ultimately, I know what the end result is. However, I'm still going to do it. So it's like, it's psychopathic behavior. No two ways about it. And so it's an internal conflict all the time. I want that. I know I can't have that, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to punish them for my problem. But I could be incorrect as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Since we're on this subject, see, a lot of people have been asking the why question. Now, you know that the counter-racist scientist camp kind of breaks into two camps, maybe. And there's a lot of different ways that it divides up. But one of the basic ways it divides up is there's the group of us who are interested in understanding why, who believe that understanding why is key to formulating a solution. I'm in that camp. There's another camp that believes that you don't need to understand why a crime is being committed. You just need to understand how it's being committed in order to keep it from being committed again. I somewhat understand the logic of that. I do not agree with it because every how eventually can be transformed into a why. You know that when you're talking with a child because they ask you why something happens and you give them an answer. And they say, but why is that? Which makes you understand that all you really did is explain how. So, for instance, they say, why did Daddy get sick? Why is Daddy sneezing? And you say, well, Daddy was around Uncle Bill, and Uncle Bill had a cold, and so he caught it from Uncle Bill. And you think that you've explained why. And then the little child says, but why did he catch it from Uncle Bill? Why did that happen? And so then you go into viruses, and you explain viruses to them and bacteria, what have you, and then they just keep telling you why. So every how becomes a why, and until you understand it as most fundamentally as you can how the thing works, which is really why.
If Dr. could be allowed to provide a synthesis here from the two camps.
Yeah, go ahead.
The way I see it, knowing why will tell you, as far as if you know the motivations, that can kind of help you see when it's going to happen again. If you know what triggers it, what's the motivation behind it, that can help you expect it. Knowing the how lets you probably know how the mechanism so you can counter it. So you need both. If you just focus solely on the how without thinking about the why, yeah, you'll know how to stop it, but you'll be blindsided as to when the attack is going to come. If you know why, you know when the attack is going to come, but then you may not have the proper countermeasures. I could be totally wrong. I'm just hypothesizing, of course.
That's what science is all about. We shouldn't stop each other from hypothesizing. That's what it's all about. But scientists, and it seems like everybody on this line is open to this, is we think critically as we can. We're open to it. We put our hypotheses out there, and we're open for revision because what we're trying to do is solve a problem, not just be right for the sake of being correct. We're trying to solve a problem. So I see exactly what you're saying. It's like science and engineering. Usually science is concerned with the why, and engineering is the application, which is the how. And it seems to me that you got to have that theory first before you can do the application. And if you know the why, you'll know whether or not the application that you've designed, can stop the problem entirely. Like, so, for instance, I don't know. Metaphors are getting all over the place, but if you know that it's germs, microorganisms that causes diseases, then you don't just you'll know that washing your hands takes care of all of it. Instead of designing one medicine that kills a particular virus, yes, it killed that virus, but now what happens when the next virus comes up? Whereas if you know that it's...
learn how each of them work and find out which ones are really pathogenic, which ones are benign, that are non-pathogenic, because it's kind of like you got to kind of learn the whole system. If you just try to wipe something without understanding how it works, there can be other downstream effects that were not anticipated.
That's also true. That is also true. Okay, so now the other thing I wanted to ask you about is if we're talking about, this came up in the last Oh, this was on Gus's show. The question of the capacity to do hurtful things to other people. I was going to raise Bobby Wright in that discussion, but what do you have a hypothesis? Would you like to offer one? Do you think that it's not monolithic? I'm not going to say that every dark-skinned person has more capacity for empathy than people who have pale skin. I don't even know if there's a dividing line between like how much melanin do you have to have, not just in your skin but within your organ system in order for you to have a greater likelihood for empathic systems. I don't even know. But if we were just say to compare, what anybody would consider an African-looking person, whatever that is, to a pale-skinned person with straight hair that normally comes out of that, with blue eyes that comes out of Europe. Do you think that there are some averages that have to do with sociopathy, lack of empathy?
Okay, this is 215 speaking. I don't know if the other speaker from 450 is still here. Honestly, now this I don't know. First of all, I personally cannot speak on whether melanin is really a neurotransmitter or not. And even if it was, as far as melanin on the skin, I don't think, unless somehow it also flows through our axons and maybe conducts unless it can conduct neurological impulses faster than the traditional axonal action potentials. If that's the case, then maybe it might be an extrasensory mode that we have that those who have less melanin have. I cannot confirm or deny that. But as far as the capacity for empathy or for evil, I think it may have to do more with as far as collective experience over time. If people have been oppressed more, they've been dealt, for lack of a better word, the shitty end of the stick, then yeah, they may have a better capacity to empathize because they've had to endure it, as opposed to those who've been in a position of power, who've been in the position to do the oppressing. Then in order to perpetuate a system like that, you kind of have to deaden your capacity to empathize. So I don't know if there's so much a biological basis to it.
Yeah, but the thing is, the people...
No, you go ahead, sir.
Can you repeat that, please?
I was basically saying that if people in power, because you're saying if you're less advantaged, you'd have more empathy, but the people in power are destroying the planet. And I don't think anybody who's ever been in power before white supremacy in recorded history ever tried to destroy the planet. So I think there's evidence of people trying to destroy something that is actually, you need the resources on this planet to survive, but yet you're destroying it you're claiming to do research. So I think we have to look at their actions. We have to actually just look on what they're doing, and then we can sit back and say, okay, who else is doing this that's ever been in power?
If I may say this, and I'm not trying to be an apologist, because believe me, I'm not. I've had enough bad interactions with them. But the thing is, if in latter days, when you had people of other ethnic groups, colored people, who, when those groups were the more dominant forces, if we had the technology then that we do now, we don't know what they would have done. We don't know if they probably would have turned as destructive. Because there's a difference between when you're out to conquer the world, on horseback with spears and shields, as opposed to now where you have the nuclear technology. I mean, if Genghis Khan had that kind of technology, God knows what he would have done.
Well, I think we might have had that technology.
Well, I believe we had greater technology, but I believe that going back to the original question, the power and the know-how in the hands of a corrupt mind leads you to do those things. Whereas, hey, I got a gun, but that doesn't mean I shoot you.
Yeah, but that could explain. Maybe we did have that technology, because there are some hypotheses that the whole cataclysm of Atlantis was because of the misuse of technology, which allegedly, well, I think some Rosicrucians and Masons probably believe that surviving Atlanteans founded Kemet. But I don't know.
Let's back up to something that we do know, though. Okay, let's back up to something that we do know. And this is it even in Dr. Welsing's book, The ISIS Paper. It is a matter of record that when white people landed on the shores of all people of the places where all peoples of color have, I hate to use that word, where all people who have color in their skin, a lot of it, lived, that it was always, without exception, the white people who initiated hostilities. It was never the reverse. And when colored peoples did their navigations and went to shores where white people lived, because that did happen, they did not initiate hostilities. It was always the white people. Why?
Well, if we look beyond humanity just at a basic instinctual level, an animal that is in fear will always strike. That's when they're most vicious. And again, going again from the framework that's postulated by Dr. Welsing, if you look at it from the perspective of that need to ensure genetic survival against genetic annihilation, then it makes perfect sense that they would always be the aggressors and stuff, because maybe at an unconscious level they know that these people, even if they're being friendly and stuff, by the sheer nature of the fact that if we breed, the offsprings will always come out as them and not us, that we're going to be wiped out. That would be a driving force at a very, very unconscious level. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I cannot corroborate that.
Okay, so that wouldn't be psychopathy. That would just be fear. That would just be fear of either sexual impotency or genetic annihilation. That wouldn't be... Hello?
Hello? I hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure the mic was... Yes.
Yeah,
I'm back. I had to... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is this 213?
Yes. I had to click over, but I'm back.
Okay. So that wouldn't be psychopathy, but here is what I want to raise, and I get to do this, I guess, because it's it's the CREE show. So here's the thing. Somebody raised this on another show recently. Yes, white supremacy is the functional form of racism on the planet. It's the only form of functional racism on the planet right now and has been for some time. Got it. Agree with that. However, I'm not sure, I'm raising this as a question, I'm not sure that the hostility that other lighter-skinned peoples, I'm talking about people who normally call themselves Latinos, who are straight-haired and lighter-skinned, I'm not talking about Dominicans, or that type of thing, or Brazilians. People who call themselves Asians, so on, these people that we call in-betweens, these people who say that they're not white, but they're very clear that they're not black, that their clear hostility, their clear contempt, their clear antipathy, their clear mistreatment of people who are clearly defined as black, I am not convinced that all of that has been conditioned in them by white supremacists. I am not convinced that that would not be present even without the system of racism, white supremacy. And that furthermore, if something like the Crest theory or the Ross theory, which is my variation of the Crest theory that I explained, it being about sexual jealousy and not about genetic annihilation, but it's variation thereof. If either one of those is true, either the Crest, that it's about sex or genetic annihilation, then why wouldn't these other types whose genes are not as strong have the same fear that white people have? And why wouldn't they act upon it similarly so that it didn't require?
I can explain. Yes, it is actually very simple. Because every other group that are non-white, their traits are dominant over white. What happens is when you deal with certain traits in genetics, it's not always clear-cut Mendelian as with what Gregor Mendel saw with the peas, where they're either purple or white. For those pea flowers. Sometimes you have some traits where there can be a gradation, And what happens is, of all the different peoples on the planet, those classified as black, those who have the most melanin, those phenotypical traits as far as facial structure, lips, eyes, and stuff, those are dominant over all the others. So even over Latinos, Asians, we would not so much annihilate them, but again, if they breed with black, the child comes out with mostly the Negroid features. So under that framework, yeah, that's why they have an apprehension against us, just like the whites do, because of all people, we're the biggest threat. And that's why in white supremacy, the black male is the biggest threat. Because as Dr. Welton says, only men can impose sexual intercourse and commit, forcefully commit rape for the purpose of impregnation. And if black men do it, the kids will come out black, as opposed, if you understand what I mean.
I do. And evolutionarily, a lot of sexual intercourse did occur by force. I mean, that's just a fact. It wasn't always consensual. There is within our species a desire to have affection and consensual sex, but evolutionarily, in our species, and I don't know, how much of this is at play in the psychology of the species now, but a lot of sexual intercourse occurred by force. I'm tending to believe that that's more the psychology of white people than black people. I don't know how much of that is part of the evolutionary biology and psychology of black people, but perhaps it is present in the evolutionary psychology of other less dominant gene types. And I agree with you. I think that's why they all have that antipathy towards us. I don't think that just if white supremacy were erased today, I don't think that would stop these other gene types from having problems with us. I don't think so.
Yeah, but you know what? But I would like to even put this into the discussion. I mean, you have blacks who actually oppose white supremacy, and knowingly and willingly. So where do they stand? Because I mean, it's within my belief. It's within my belief system that power does not discriminate. I mean, if somebody has the ability to impose their views and values upon someone, it really doesn't matter what the color of their skin actually is. They are going to do it. In fact, some people would actually say that it's human nature for a person, once he or she reaches a certain level of power and authority, for them to want to go out and abuse that authority. And even before the concept of white supremacy, and I don't know if the other guy is on the phone, I completely understood his viewpoint, but even before the concept or implementation of white supremacy, you had power corrupting. You had people who were in great forms of authority, positions of authority, and they were corrupted. You
cannot compare some other time before white supremacy and corruption. The corruption, yes, that's a part of just being a human being.
Yeah, but the thing is, corruption is corruption, and power is power. And at the end of the day, it has always been around. And I'm not validating white supremacy. I'm not. But the fact is, it has always been around. And I think we have to analyze this as humans, and we somehow, we have to look at a way to stop all people, everyone, from abusing power and from being able to, let's say, galvanize that amount of influence and power onto people. Because
hang on. I think we have a common basis. I don't think this is a disagreement at all, because I think everybody, I would hope, and I know that the premise of my show, if you look on the show page, is that this show is for everyone who wishes to evolve both the will and the ability to do what? To replace the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice. Not replace it with a system of black supremacy or yellow supremacy or money supremacy, but to replace it with a system of justice. And justice meaning what? Where no one is mistreated for any reason, and in which the persons who need the most help receive the most help. So, yeah, I don't believe that a system of justice, I don't think there's any evidence that a system of justice has ever existed anywhere on the planet. And so, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it can't be. It certainly doesn't mean.
Yeah, I never said that it shouldn't. I never said it shouldn't. And in fact, if I was able to finish my point, I was basically saying same thing, that, yes, we need to take away white supremacy and put something in position that's going to make sure that no one is able to, like I said, galvanize that much influence and power over anybody. I mean, just think about it, people. I mean, you know what they say, power corrupts, and I absolutely agree with you in terms of what your show description actually is. And like I said, if I was able to finish my point, you would have saw.
I agree with
I agree exactly what you're saying, but what my point is, it's not mistreating anybody. It has to be mistreating anything, because there's no way you're going to be able to mistreat the planet and still treat everybody with dignity and respect and justice. So the first thing you have to do is don't mistreat anything on the planet. So people are missing. You can't worry about everybody on the planet, every person on the planet, if you're just mistreating, the water, the trees. I mean, that's part of the whole thing. Everything on this planet is connected, and once people understand that, then we can go on the path of justice. But I think the first thing is we got to stop tearing up stuff we need, resources we need to survive. So,
It is really interesting that you're saying this, because Mr. Fuller would say that it's the reverse, and here's why I think he would say it, and here's why I think I agree, although I am open to being persuaded otherwise. And I want to make sure that you get a chance to respond to this and reply to this. So if anybody else can hold off too, because I did interrupt him being, I'm not sure which area code. That people need to give me handles so I can recognize the voice and put a name to it. But Mr. Fuller says that the purpose of his book is his ultimate objective is to bring peace. That creating justice is to promote peace, and the purpose of promoting peace is to promote correctness. Okay, so he defines correctness as correct balance of people, animals, and things. But he says that you have to get justice, which is balance between people, before you can get to the greater balance of people, animal, and things. And the reason I think that I agree with him is something similar, to what you see when you look at the movie Avatar. There are a great number of white people now who are very concerned with making sure that the ecosystem on planet Earth is restored. They want things to be they want the bounties that come from the earth and all its minerals and all of its plants and so on to be healthy again and back in balance, but only so that they can have it. And and to the degree that they have to exploit those resources again to stay in charge of all the people who are on it, they will do it again. As long as they're intent on dominating us, I think they'll do whatever they have to.
Again, it is necessary for their survival. It's not right, but it's necessary if they want to retain that position of power. Now, as far as when you say some people who have the concern for the ecosystem, it's sometimes not even so much that so they can use it. It's just that you have some individuals who have reached this point where they care more about animal life than they do, say, about humans. They'll protest, animal research and stuff, but they will be the same ones who will be all for aborting babies, not because, it's a risk to the mother, but let's say it's inconvenient or because, it needs a birth control. They're the ones, you have some individuals out there who care more about plants and animals than they do about humans. And you have to, again, like you said, you need justice among people first, and then we can bring balance to the rest.
That makes sense. But in the meantime, as an individual person, especially non-white people, should practice this on their own. You shouldn't have to wait, because we never know how long it's going to take to replace racism and white supremacy. I'm saying in the meantime,
but we always
individual
did.
basis. I'm saying is animals, we partake in this destruction of this planet, because they propaganda and say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but they don't actually do it. They just show some commercials and run a video and play with your emotions for a while, but they really don't stop doing it. Our chicken ain't going out of business. McDonald's ain't going nowhere. None of these places are going anywhere. That's just all just to make you feel good for the moment. But they're actually not doing none of that stuff that they're advertising. Their actions. If you want to do is sit back and watch their actions. They can say whatever they want to say. But at the end of the day, their actions showing that, hey, we saying one thing but doing another. Just we saying one thing and doing another about racism and white supremacy. So what I'm saying is, as non-white people, you got to understand that if you go back to where we came from, there was no cows, there was no chickens, there was no pigs. That stuff came from a laboratory. That stuff was man-made. That was hybridized food that we're eating today. So I think we got to be more conscious on what in the world are we actually participating in when we want to replace justice. I mean, replace white supremacy with justice. That's my point.
I would slightly object.
Well, exactly, and I would like to extend on that, and it's true. I mean, you have to begin to boycott certain practices of white supremacy that you engage in, if you know, because it's clear that, like he has said, I think oftentimes we fail to look at theory and practice. We look at what people are saying, but in practice, we oftentimes, when you look at practice, you find that they're not doing anything of the sort. So we have to begin to start to boycott certain practices that we do that's basically a part of white supremacy.
Well, what I was going to say is, as far as the comment that was made, I'm not trying to pick words, but the comments about, we didn't have pork and beef and stuff, I think us non-white folks, we did use, we did have agrarian societies, cattle raising and stuff, but we only did it to the extent of what was needed. It wasn't driven by the motive of just profit, which I think to some degree that's an inherent part of the white supremacy racism system, where it's not just about dominating the planet, but, making as much of a profit by any cost necessary. Whereas if they had the mindset of have what they need, then we would not be in the position as far as with all the other side effects environmentally, in addition to the sociological side effects with people classified.
Exactly.
Anyway, folks, I'm sorry I have to cut and run, but this was very interesting, and CREE, it was a pleasure to actually talk to you live. I've been catching your show in the archive, and I will keep on doing so, and I'll keep on promoting it to my friends so they can come and check you out.
Appreciate you calling the show, sir.
Well, you guys all have a good evening.
You too, and you call again.
Oh.
That might be a good segue. You can never, Fuller can go for. I've been at some of his lectures, and he's amazing. Way up into his early 70s, he could stand and deliver in a cogent fashion for 6 to 8 hours and still be willing to go 3 more. There never seems to be a place where you could feel like there's a natural end to a discussion that has to do with replacing white supremacy with justice. So at some point, you try to find a segue and say until next time. And I think that is what I'm going to have to do, because unfortunately I do have to attend to my offspring. I had her, so, and I have affection for her, so I owe her some things, so I'm going to do that, and I want to thank you.
Well, don't forget to get the books, my friend.
Oh, I wrote them down. As a matter of fact, I will read them. I will look at the bibliographies, and hopefully I can get some guests out of them.
Great. Nice show, by the way. This is my first time, actually. Someone posted the link on my Facebook page, and I clicked it, and, lo and behold, she actually was on the show with you. So, again, nice show. Good job.
I appreciate the encouragement, sir. I hope everyone will call again and have a good evening. Good night.